My name's Chris Patten. I was the last British governor of Hong Kong from 1992 to 97. I had 5 very happy years in Hong Kong with my family. I think that Hong Kong was one of the greatest cities in the world, combining much that's best about Asian life and Asian culture, Chinese life and Chinese culture, and the values elsewhere. But Hong Kong had its own distinctive set of values and a real sense of citizenship. And perhaps I can say something about that. What I'd like to say to them is that I think they will make a wonderful success of their lives so long as they stay here. And I hope they do stay, but I hope that if they have a choice and can go back to a free society, they'll be able to do it. But I think they'll be a huge, huge part of Britain's success in the future. And I think we're very, very lucky to have them. And I say this to them as well: young people from Hong Kong will help to correct them. And I hope my grandchildren will be working with you to help correct them and make this a better place. But what you can depend on is that you'll get an extremely warm and friendly welcome. I can't remember a group of exiles coming here in the past who've been as welcomed as people have been from Hong Kong. So I'm sorry that life in Hong Kong has been made so difficult. But at least there is one good thing for Britain, and that is that you're with us. And we'll be able, I hope, to stand up for the best values, which sooner or later will return to Hong Kong as well. Understand how painful it is for people to leave a city which they love, to live elsewhere, to live somewhere else, and help them when they need help, and encourage them to understand how welcome they are, and recognize that when it comes to most areas of life, they're going to be pretty competitive with you, whether it's in the classroom or on the tennis court or in the golf course, or even, I guess, playing football, and not yet cricket, but maybe that one day too. So they'll be really, really welcome colleagues, and I'm sure they'll add to the enjoyable aspects of your education, but there'll be red-hot competition, I promise you. Britain acquired Hong Kong during a really difficult period for the Qing dynasty as a result of the First and Second Opium Wars, which, as I said, couldn't conceivably be justified. Even at the time, people like Queen Victoria, the British Queen, thought that the efforts to sell opium to the Chinese, in which process some Chinese, of course, later on the Communist Party, took part, that was indefensible and the wrong thing to do. It produced the 2 wars of the 1840s and 1860s, as a result of which Britain acquired, first of all, Hong Kong Island, and then the Kowloon Peninsula and the land adjoining to it. Later on in the century, with the Qing dynasty still very weak, there was another series of land assaults on the Qing dynasty, as a result of which Britain got what are called the new territories, on which there are now 7 new cities built, which provided the hinterland for what had already been acquired in Hong Kong, on a 99-year lease. I think when people sign a 99-year lease, they sometimes think that 99 years will never turn up. Most of the 20th century, Hong Kong was a colonial territory for which Britain was responsible. And it had the sort of things that Britain gave to all its colonies. It had the rule of law, it had a good and pretty clean civil service, good public administration, increasingly good schools and education. The one thing it didn't have was democracy, or the promise of independence, partly because I think of some not very far-sighted policies by British governments who used to say that people in Hong Kong were only interested in making money, they weren't interested in politics, which is insulting. Secondly, there were also those who listened too much to what the Chinese Communist Party said. And what the Chinese Communist Party, like Zhou Enlai, said to Britain was, you can't start introducing democracy. Because if you make Hong Kong democratic, people will start to think they're going to be treated as though they were Singapore or Malaysia or another British colony, and will have their independence in 1997 when the lease on the new territories runs out. And they said that's not going to happen. What's going to happen is that Hong Kong is going to be returned to the motherland, to China. The interesting thing about describing China or the mainland as the motherland is that the overwhelming majority of the population in Hong Kong, maybe 2/3 or more, are either themselves or the families of refugees from communism. People who fled the Cultural Revolution, the famine, the Great Leap Forward, all the worst depravities of Mao-era communism, and later people who fled China after the Tiananmen massacres. So it was ridiculous to think that the Chinese Communist Party would be able to persuade people in Hong Kong that it was a return to a motherland they loved. But the Hong Kong people were kept on being told by China that in order to show you're patriotic, you have to love the Communist Party. But how could you expect people, when they'd gone through those experiences, to love communism? And in about 10, 12 years before, we agreed a treaty with China called the Joint Declaration. And the Joint Declaration was an international treaty lodged at the UN, which guaranteed Hong Kong's way of life for 50 years after 1997, and guaranteed that Hong Kong would have a high degree of autonomy. And after 1997, China didn't do too bad a job. Of course, they interfered more in what was happening in Hong Kong, but they didn't stamp out Hong Kong's freedoms as they've been doing recently. What they did was to go back on the promises they'd made about helping to develop democracy in Hong Kong, which we'd been doing before 1997. And then it changed and became much more awkward when President Xi Jinping became leader, an old-fashioned dictator, a great friend of Mr. Putin. He calls him Mr. Putin his best friend in the international community. And he regarded Hong Kong, I think, as a real challenge, because Hong Kong represented all the things which I think Chinese communists think are an existential threat to the control that Chinese communists have over the mainland. They dislike the rule of law. They dislike giving people a say in the way they're governed through elections and in other ways. They dislike civil society, not non-governmental organizations which campaign for particular issues and bring people together. They hated the idea that education should tell people what had actually happened rather than what the Communist Party wanted them to think had happened. So if you go to school in mainland China, nobody will tell you about Tiananmen Square and the massacres there. Nobody will tell you about what happened during the Great Leap Forward or the Great Famine. You're not allowed to know about things like that. And history is doctored, and the Chinese call the attempt to give a real account of what's happened in the past historical nihilism, a terrible word. And what it means is the Chinese Communist Party only wants you to know what they want you to know. It was what Stalin called engineering the soul. And it's, of course, exactly the opposite of what happened in Hong Kong, where people had a huge amount of freedom. They had all the freedoms that you associate with an open society and a liberal democracy, even though they didn't have as many voting rights as some of us would have liked them to have had. So that's the background to what's happened today with Xi Jinping's terrible crackdown, a vengeful and comprehensive attempt to put Hong Kong in handcuffs. And I'm afraid what the Chinese Communist Party would like is for Hong Kong to continue to exist as a place where you could find wealthy bankers, but not with any Hong Kongers. They don't like Hong Kongers because Hong Kongers are, first of all, as I said, refugees from communism in very large measure. And secondly, because Hong Kongers aren't proud of Chinese communism, they're proud of being Chinese in the best sense of the word, not of Chinese communism. Above all, they're proud of being Hong Kongers.